After today, when you look at Toronto's landscape and all its dimensions, what do you see, and where would you begin to look more closely at finding a cultural heritage landscapes within the city?
Okay, it's a good question, and I think I always like to start with the fact that I think Toronto has three natural geographic features. Most people get two of them, they don't get the third. But the lake, you got the ravine system, we have the escarpment. And those three, I think, are the defining, for me, one of the starting points in terms of the understanding the city. The second thing is look at where culture meets nature. So where does the city intersect with the ravines? Obviously the waterfront. What happens when you go up the hill, up Yonge Street, up to St. Clair, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you sort of went through the whole city with that lens as a starting point, I think it might help to identify some of these special cultural landscapes. You might not, but I think it's a useful exercise to go through. The other thing that I just want to touch on is what came out for me in all the presentations is the importance of experience and the values that people place on their interpretation of the cultural landscape. And so we had some fun. I sat in one group that Brenda was running, and she, I didn't hold them up. She asked everybody to develop a mind map in like 5 minutes. So what is your personal daily cultural experience? And some of them are fascinating. I know you can't see them from here, but I'll just describe some of them. The first one did the sort of golden horseshoe from Lake Erie all the way up, Niagara River escarpment, back to Toronto. And that was somebody's personal thing that they really valued. The next layer, I think, was somebody who never goes north of the 401. It starts with the 401 and everything is south. And it's got a whole bunch of interesting things on there. And that's what matters to them. And the third one, if we focused right in, I don't know who did these, I wouldn't have names, but it's on Queen Street, on the Queen Street neighborhood, in great detail, within like 3 or 4 blocks. And it goes on and on and on. I had to do one too. I live just north of Yonge and Bloor. I'm in a condo, so I had to put the LCBO liquor store at Summerhill on my map. Very important cultural landscape. And actually, it is, because as you know, the clock tower has got a lot of significance in terms of history. So those kinds of things, I think, are revealing. And I'll just say one other thing, and then we'll pass it back, is that what this little exercise showed, there are both personal cultural landscapes and shared cultural landscapes. And I think we need to try and figure out in this approach of where this discussion goes, how do you identify those that matter?
All right, so as we think about how to recognize them and then perhaps how to protect them in one sense or another, what's standing in the way of that process? What are sort of the obstacles that prevent a recognition of cultural heritage landscapes as such?
Yeah, that's the tough one. Lots of things. And I got a little list here, so let's run through a few of them. I think, first of all, in terms of cultural heritage landscapes, many people said they're an identifier. Carolyn talked about that in particular. And one of the things that we all, I think, appreciated was the absolute critical importance of the First Nations recognition in whatever comes forward out of this. That has to be front and center and part and parcel of any future work. The other thing is that understanding connections between people's places, environment, over time. We're all, unfortunately, not going to be here probably in 100 years from now. But somebody else will. And so what's that ongoing, passing down of the knowledge, of the history, of the cultural landscapes, of the things that matter, that people care about? And I can guarantee you people will care about the waterfront in 100 years. They'll care about the ravines. They'll care about all kinds of things. So, those things have to be high up on the list. And the other thing I just wanted to touch on is that what came out in all the sessions for me is that it's pretty obvious people care passionately about cultural landscapes and heritage. And there's a sense of ownership of them, whether it's shared or personal. And if they're threatened, if you know, like take, I think Kensington Market maybe was one example a few years ago when it was threatened. People rose up all over the place and said, "Really, you don't screw around with them. You don't touch them." Yeah, there'll be changes within Kensington, that's obvious, but there's power in the people in that, in terms of that emotion, and we shouldn't forget that. When there's a sense of loss that's threatened, and the Battle of Falls was another example, we tap into that reservoir of energy.
Yeah, that's interesting, and well, we often think, or maybe I'm alone in this, but I don't think so. There's often a perception that Torontonians aren't engaged with their history or aren't necessarily deeply proud of the place, but I think we see evidence that we Torontonians do care about the city, especially when something that is an institution is threatened in some way. You know, you see that in Kensington. Honest Ed's, the redevelopment of Honest Ed's is a really interesting example of that as well. A store where I'm guessing many of the people defending Honest Ed's right now haven't shopped there in many, many years. We're hungry for these cultural touchstones of one kind or another. On the other hand, the city is undergoing tremendous growth right now, as we can see looking around in this neighborhood of all places. 40,000 people will be living in 1 square kilometer at King and Spadina if all of the developments that are now approved go through. Obviously, it's not quite that intense everywhere, but all the same, the city is growing, as Brendan was saying earlier, at a considerable pace and has been for a long time. How do we reconcile establishing and protecting cultural landscapes with the evolving needs of the city that is becoming, that is changing rapidly into a different sort of place?
Yeah, you always ask the easy questions here. But I think we all know the level of intensification the city's going through. And I got news for you. It's going to be a lot more intensive over the next decade or more, at least. I don't see this changing. I don't see this stopping. So the fact of the matter is, you got to figure out, how do you shape that intensification? How can you achieve the objectives with cultural landscapes while still in a dynamic, booming, growing city, especially obviously in the central area of Toronto. So one of the things that came out for me that I think is very important is what Julian started off with, which was the little statement in the provincial policy statement that basically, I'm paraphrasing, says cultural landscapes shall be protected, or will be, whatever the language is, but it prevails, it's supreme. And that chart that I think you had, where you've got the provincial policy statement up here, and then there's a Planning Act, and there's an Ontario Heritage Act. You know, I think you need to put a lot of emphasis on putting meat on the bones in the provincial policy statement. Because right now, I'm going to be very blunt, I think it's there for political reasons. I think it's quite hollow. It just says, yes, they shall be recognized, protected, or what have you, right? So what does that mean? How are you going to deal with a situation where you're at, I don't know, an OMB hearing, and a developer appeals and has got all the eggs in the basket and paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for consultants, and the provincial policy statement is still part and parcel of this exercise? Be an interesting question. I have some hope. I was talking to Mary at one of the breaks, and she told me, I asked, how is the official plan review going? And she said, well, it's basically done, and the good news is that of course, the new official plan, or the revised official plan, has a lot of pretty good policy statements in it about heritage that weren't there 15 years ago, because the Heritage Act had changed in the interim. And she told me a little story that BUILD, the development organization for all the developers throughout the GTA, challenged the heritage policies at the OMB. And they were mediated by a very well-experienced member of the board who was the mediator. And I got to tell this story because I think it's very powerful. She said that she started off, the OMB member said, well, okay, you've objected to all these. Let me just tell you something. The provincial policy statement says shall. The Planning Act says heritage will be recognized and every official plan will have heritage policies in it. So this isn't an optional discussion. You've got to deal with this, right? And there was a mediated process that took quite a while, I'm sure. And the end result, from what I understand, is these policies are now approved and in force. So that gives me some optimism. So I just tell that little story. The second thing about how do you deal with these contradictions, the huge development pressure and these desires. I think the second theme here I wrote down was overcome silos of jurisdiction and confusions, one of the presenters said. And if you think of all I wrote them down here. We've got the provincial policy statement, you have the Planning Act, you have the Heritage Act, you have Heritage Conservation District, you have the official plan, you have the zoning bylaw, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And each one of them can say something about all this stuff, right? But again, the role of the PPS is pretty supreme here. And I have to say, I've said this when I was chief planner. I remember dealing with the city council. It was, I guess it was Mel Lastman, and the 57-member council then. And I would guarantee you, 90% of the city councilors didn't know the difference between an official plan or a zoning bylaw. I don't think they still do, frankly. The reality is, an official plan, I'm serious, the official plan is about vision. Zoning is about precision. You don't put density numbers, setbacks, landscape, open space, and all that stuff in an official plan. That's not what it's designed for. It's a long-term visionary, directional document. And that is a very important distinction that we've got to keep in mind as we work through all this. So there's some of the thought.
Brendan raised the possibility that one way of framing a cultural heritage landscape would be as a place that has evolved through time, or as a landscape that has taken on a series of different characters through time. Looking at Toronto, where do you see opportunities for cultural heritage landscape to speak to the city's history, which, by the way, is not commemorated by any museum and is not often sort of marked in any particularly visible way?
Yeah, another really critical question. I think we've heard from many speakers here that, well, lots of things have been done. The track record is not as good as it should be, obviously, in terms of success. And one of the themes that I think various people hit on was this business of the importance of education of all stakeholders, right down from the kids in grade school all the way up, in terms of what is a cultural heritage landscape. You know, every little kid who walks to school experiences a cultural heritage landscape in their own neighborhood, right? And they should walk to school. But the reality is that personal experience all the way through their life cycle will change, obviously. But that should be part and parcel of the mindset. That's why I love these little mind maps that we did. So that's one thing, the education of stakeholders and the power of people to, in fact, you know, come together and define these things. We've had examples that were mentioned here, many of them. Toronto Islands was suggested, Kensington was suggested, many other areas, and there's no shortage. The other thing that came out here for me is there's a wide typology of cultural landscapes. So I think it'd be wrong as the approach to try and sort of list the encyclopedia of cultural landscapes and then try and, you know, start with details, and I think you got to come at it from the other side. So that's one thing. The second thing that I think came out today, the importance of language and dispelling the myths about language. When a lot of people, I don't know about, not this group, I'm sure, but a lot of people, when you mention heritage, they think freeze dry, like preserve, don't touch, right? And as everyone knows, it means all kinds of things. It's listing, it's designating. In some cases it is you don't touch. In other cases you adapt. In other cases, you add on, et cetera, et cetera. So the difference between the preservation versus conserving was talked about in several of the speakers, and I think that's important to get crystal clear. And the third thing I'll touch on in this little theme here is pretty obvious. One size doesn't fit all. All these neighborhoods are different, all these experiences are different, and everything else. And when I was hearing the speakers, I kind of thought when somebody said, well, you know, you can make a case that if 1 out of 10 items is pulled away, you still have 9 left, so that's not bad, right? I think you have to kind of think of it as a jigsaw puzzle. And you don't see the picture of the puzzle until you put all the pieces in, right? And if you picture any jigsaw puzzle and had a bunch of pieces torn out of it, you didn't know what the hell you're looking at. And I think it's a way of approaching these kinds of things, and the timing is very important, because my view, I've talked to Jennifer and Keith Matt many times on this, and I think they're all aware of this. I mean, the volume of development applications in the pipeline for this city is at an all-time high.
2,600 or something.
Oh, there you go. Okay, 2,600 and something. But it's unbelievable. We have, tons of applications for big buildings, mid-sized buildings, mid-rise buildings, also. It's unprecedented. And I don't think it's going to stop. So I think timing is really critical to put meat on the bones of this PPS statement if you want to actually make an impact and put a dent in all this. And the very last thing I want to say under this is what my favorite mayor always told me, David Crombie. Everything is connected to everything. And that's the jigsaw puzzle analogy. Heritage, cultural landscapes is connected to neighborhoods, is connected to transportation, connected to, you name it. And I used to tell my planning staff to help visualize, how all these pieces might fit together. Just think of your own personal daily life cycle. When you open your eyes to when you go to bed at night, where do you go? Who do you interact with? It's where you live, it's where you work, where you shop, where you go to school, how you move around, entertainment, recreation, the whole life cycle of all that stuff is part of like these mind maps here. So all those things I think are useful to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. The one project I've been working on for the last little while is a revision of an architectural guidebook to the city. Patricia McHugh's guidebook, which is called Toronto Architecture, a City Guide, which was last published in 1989. So I'm revising it, and as you can imagine, a few things have changed. But one particular, one thing that I've noticed is that while she was not particularly bound by the bias of the moment, it's still difficult it was still difficult in the earlier mid-1980s to look at the modernist buildings of 15 years before or 20 years before and see them as historical artifacts. They weren't old enough yet at that point to be venerable, and at the height of postmodernism, it was difficult to see them as see the value in those buildings and in those landscapes. I think we're at a different point now with respect to the building and the urbanism and the landscape of the 1950s through the 1970s, but it seems that's a particular problem for Toronto because so much of the city was built up in that period, and there are still a lot of people, including many people in positions of power, who find it difficult to look at the 1960s as historical and to look at the work that comes out of that period as historical. And yet, if you don't do that in Toronto, you're missing a significant chunk of the built heritage of the city, which applies also to landscape. I'm thinking of the gardens along University Avenue, which ERA helped draw my attention to at last year's Cultural Landscape Conference, which I hadn't really paid adequate attention to, and which are in fact very much a product of their time and are very interesting. But to come back to this as a question, how do we deal with things that are not yet old? How do we deal with the city building of 2 generations ago that perhaps hasn't got the patina or has not sunk sufficiently into people's mental maps to be seen as heritage? And are there particular cases in Toronto where you see a need to do that?
I guess, I'd sort of come at that in terms of, again, dispelling myths, just because something isn't old doesn't mean it doesn't have value, and it doesn't have significance, and it's not part of a cultural landscape, or it's not part of heritage. And I remember when I started working at the city in '73, I was a lot younger. The TD Center just got built. It was 65, I think it was. And I remember the oldest Toronto Historical Board was going through the process of designating buildings, and the TD Center came up to be designated. And I remember people said, "What? The media, the newspapers? What are you, crazy? It's not even 10 years old." But you know what? It is designated, and it should be, and I'm glad it is for all kinds of obvious reasons. So I think maybe a way to get at that might be in terms of, look at around the room, we're all in different ages. We all have different life experiences so far. And for us, what's old might be young for somebody else and vice versa and all over the place. So I think this kind of lens might have to be applied in a different way like that. And a couple of questions that I think are really important for everyone to answer is, so what does this mean for me, and what does it mean for us? Very simple, very basic. What does cultural landscapes mean for me, for you individually, and for us as a citizenry and collective of the city of Toronto? And you'll get all kinds of different answers, and that's fine. It should be, right? But you've got to answer that, and that might be a way to look forward. A couple other things that are obviously came up over and over again. Just why is this place important? Why does it matter, whatever you're talking about? And you have to be able to clearly spell that out. And the third one that I wrote down here, I couldn't resist, is, and this helped me a long time ago, when I did the waterfront plan, the central waterfront principles plan. It had no land use, no heights, no densities. It was just about principles. And it was adopted unanimously by Glassman and the 57-member council. And I had 4 core principles. And where did I get that idea from? Chicago. How many people here have been to Chicago? That's what I thought. So, the waterfront looks quite different there. Open, green, corridor, et cetera, et cetera. That waterfront resulted from the adoption of one core principle that all the private and public leaders of Chicago have followed for 150 plus years. It's this, that the Chicago waterfront shall remain forever public, period. That's the principle. And, we all know about Great Chicago Fire and rebuilding and all that other stuff, Daniel Burnham plan, but the power of these simple principles that people can buy into, whether they're Trumps or Clintons or God knows in between, that they're left, right, and center, they buy into these principles because they really mean something and they stand the test of time. And so I think that might be another way to look forward as to how do you put meat on the bones of this provincial policy statement. Because remember, the policy statement covers the entire province, not just City of Toronto. So I don't see getting specific. I see really thinking and working hard about perhaps some core principles, whether the 3 of them or 5 of them or God knows what. So those are some thoughts.
That prompts 2 questions for me. The first one is to think about Toronto in comparison with Chicago. One thing Chicago has that Toronto doesn't is a park board, right? They have a body which oversees parks for the city and has its own sources of revenue, including the land lease under Soldier Field, and therefore its own political, its own capital and its own political capital. So this is one reason that public spaces in Chicago, partly as a result of that commitment to the waterfront, have the sort of quality and importance that they have. Obviously that's not the case here. That structure doesn't exist. And our city parks, which we love or claim to, are not necessarily funded or staffed or maintained at the level that would be required to keep them excellent and to serve the community at the level that everyone would like to be served. That's only becoming more of a problem now with intensification. So what particularly could the city do to improve and maintain its existing public parks as landscapes and to create better landscapes and better public realm going forward? Do you have any particular suggestions for the city now?
Is the mayor in the room here? Again, I'm going to be very blunt, and you're going to have this discussion at the city next month, where the city manager is going to bring forward a report about, the budget and revenue tools, and what new sources of revenue should the city, not if the city should the city embrace. Because it's no longer, we can't go on like this. The reality is, the irony of, and I've said this to John, cutting the budget 2.6% or whatever it is across the board, while you're having all these great visions of, the rail deck park and all these other things, which are great. No question, and we need all the transit, we need affordable housing, we all know what we need, right? But it ain't free, and the reality is, we've been cutting these budgets for years and years. So one of the honest, hard discussions is going to be new sources of revenue. And nobody's going to like it, because every one of those new revenue tools are basically options that people will probably not want. But, and I'll give you some examples. It's everything from, a hotel tax. I can guarantee you they'll pass that because it doesn't take any sweat to do that. That's all visitors, right? But it generates, I don't know, $50 million a year or something. It's useless. The reality is you need probably to generate 2 to 3 billion new sources of revenue a year if you're serious about these things, like not only maintaining existing parks, but building rail deck parks and new things. So it's going to be, sure, property taxes always there, always tough issue, but there's all these other revenue tools. There's road tolls, there's municipal sales tax, there's municipal income tax, there's endless, there's gas tax, there's liquor tax, there's all, the irony is, this is what kills me, so many American cities that are run by right-wing Republicans have had municipal income tax, municipal sales tax, employer tax, all these things in place for years. None of these ideas are new, none, right? But here, it's the end of the earth if you even discuss it. So, we've got to have those frank discussions, and they're going to start next month. That's one thing. The second thing is the reallocation of the budget that we already have. And it is the dumbest thing, in my view. It's probably politically fair to say 2.6% cut across the board for every department. But all departments aren't created equal. And I'm biased, you'd expect me to say this. If you take out 2.6% of the city planning budget, Jennifer told me this, well, one way to do that is you could just end the Scarborough planning operation, period. That's 2.6%. Another way is to take another big chunk out. But if you take pieces out across the board, all you do is keep empty positions open, you have resources that are even more stretched, and you have all kinds of issues. So I don't have the magic answer, but other cities know that, that's the direction they have to go. And I got to say this last thing. It is not good enough to just say we need more money from the senior governments. Although I think Trudeau's on the right track with the infrastructure ideas and all the rest of it. We'll probably get a good share. But the reality is the province is totally broke. I don't care what anybody says. That's the reality of it. And so for the city to stand on the corner with a tin cup and not do anything without any skin in the game, I think is a real cop-out.
On the small scale, and this will be the last question before we open it up for a few questions from the floor. Kathy Naismith's indication of Kensington Market, raised some interesting questions because what would be happening there would be not necessarily any great public expense, but it's an interesting and challenging project to try and apply the idea of a cultural heritage landscape to very complex and layered and anarchic city neighborhood. Can you see that particularly? Can you imagine a way to, how would you begin to build a policy to protect what makes Kensington special, or perhaps by extension, other economic and social phenomena in particular neighborhoods that help make the city an interesting place?
Kathy and I talked about that at one of the breaks, and she used that word, I think it was regulation of anarchy. I agree with that. I remember when I started with the city early 70s, and Kensington was, going through its different phases of evolution, there was a huge effort on the time to, in fact, clean it up, is the best way I can describe it. It was garbage all over the place, and it was messy, and it didn't look nice, and tourists might have negative comments, and all these kinds of statements were made. And the reality is, there was a desire to say, no, leave the goddamn thing alone. It's just fine. It has its own uniqueness, its own character, its own special flavor, and all the rest of the stuff. And that was, of course, the result. And it's evolved over time. And I think it's still such an amazing place. I don't know about you, but if I have visitors to the city, it's one of the places I obviously take them to walk through. And they go bananas. They say, this is fantastic. I love this, right? So I asked Kathy, I don't know if she's still here or not, but I asked her, where else in the world is there a place with a regulation of anarchy that you could actually put down in words, whatever? And she surprised me. And I want maybe go to Julian after. She said Byward Market in Ottawa. And I don't know if that's true or not. Julian's an expert on that, but basically, as I understand it, the policies in place for the Byward Market, that I'm sure most everybody's been to, is that, yeah, you can tear stuff down, but you have to rebuild it exactly as it was. So there's no incentive to do anything. And so, you know, yeah, you have changes of uses and all those other things. But it's a very creative approach, something like that I think we need. But you don't have that everywhere, because you don't have Kensington markets everywhere. It's very unique.
Thank you. We have a few minutes, and I'm sure some of you have questions. Why don't we take it out to the floor for some questions before we close? Sure.
Test. I have a microphone here if anybody needs one.
Is that wireless?
No?
No, it's not wireless.
We are
I'll have a go.
We're in the city.
Here.
It's a question I raised in my session. I pointed out afterwards that I wasn't entirely correct, but most of us here are white. And the cultural landscapes that we need to speak about most of, Kensington Market especially. Kensington Market used to be the Jewish market. We have Chinatown. We have a Greek town. Whereas the ethnic, new Canadian, a component in our thinking about cultural heritage landscapes. And many of the cultural landscapes that those people founded were because zoning was slack, anarchy was permitted, and they created the wonderful order that somehow emerges from anarchy, the order out of chaos. So what are we going to do to encourage new Canadian? When are we going to get Aleppo Town built in Toronto? Or established? Aleppo Town.
Interesting question, especially because part of the anarchic physical quality of Kensington came from Jews bringing their models from Eastern Europe and clustering together because they were excluded from other places in the city, right? I mean, it's a product of discrimination to a certain degree. But Paul, do you want to give any response?
Just to say, I'm really glad you raised it, and you know, you look around the room, your observation's obvious, right? And I would assume that no matter what ethnic community you're from, you care just as much about your neighborhood and cultural landscape as anybody else, right? So that's a very important piece, especially in the fabric and diversity of our city, that has to be built into putting meat on the bones of this challenge that we've been presented with today. So, I mean, I'm not the person to say how you do that, but I think that would be a really strong outreach effort, part of that education involving these people from all walks of life and all backgrounds and businesses. And Kensington's a perfect example of that. Makes total sense.
Well, that also occurs to me that Toronto's immigrant, the neighborhoods that absorb immigrants into Toronto today are not predominantly Kensington Market, they're predominantly in car-oriented suburbs. So perhaps this becomes to some degree a dimension of tower renewal or other efforts to look systematically at the outer 416, but it's a little bit more difficult to define a landscape, isn't it, that's made up of strip malls. Brendan?
Actually, maybe not. I mean, you know, strip malls are not pretty to look at, but boy, are they incubators for you know, new businesses and great food and all kinds of things, right? And you know, Scarborough, North York, Etobicoke has their share of all of them. And I think that's actually something that we should not poo-poo or look down on or anything. We should actually say, maybe there should be a strip mall heritage conservation strategy. You know, seriously. I mean, because they're not going to...
Paul, didn't they say that Kensington wasn't pretty to look at?
Yeah, exactly. Because, I mean, sure, these will get redeveloped over time, a lot of the primary ones, but we're still going to have tons of these things. And they're pretty special in terms of if you go out there and talk to the people in these various strip malls.
Interesting, the idea of a landscape that's experienced not primarily on foot. How do you read that as a landscape? Perhaps some of the more abstract dimensions of cultural heritage landscapes that have been discussed today would be applicable to that. It's interesting. Questions? Yes?
It's as far as the idea of getting people interested, or at least getting them to know about Toronto's heritage. I had the good fortune of going to the Lauren Harris exhibition at the AGO, and that actually introduced me to the ward through paintings, and also the great, not only the huge enlarged photographs, period photographs, but the fire insurance plans. Oh, this is great. I mean, as I said, I love maps, right? So, but I saw I saw Joe Public in there, really getting an idea of what the ward was. Unfortunately, was, but it's
No,
through the eyes of a rich white guy.
No, I went to that exhibit too, as I'm sure many people here did. It was fascinating to see who was there. And that made me think of one other thing. As many of you know, I had the good fortune to work with Jane Jacobs when I was chief planner for a long time. And the reality is, one of the things she always said to me, she said, just don't assume people know what you know. Why the hell would they? The reality is, a lot of people they're not as old as me to start with, so they haven't had the life experience. And I always kept that in mind when I taught planning at UT in Ryerson. You know, if you're a 21, 22-year-old, you don't have the same frame of reference and base of knowledge about all the stuff that most of us here do for obvious reasons, right? And so she basically always said, you gotta pass that down. You have to teach people this. They have to relearn those lessons, your experiences, the history, the landscapes, and why this stuff is important. And people forget that. Just, you know, we're all human. We all, you know, just make assumptions. But that's a powerful lesson, I think, in this. To look at how many new Torontonians there are every year. You know, we're taking 100,000 into the region, right? They don't know hardly anything about this place. So there's a massive opportunity there.
For public outreach and about the history of the city and about the depths of its landscapes. Interesting.
My question is, someone who comes from heritage side and now joining the troops of city planning.
Lucky you.
Lucky me is right. I'm the luckiest girl in this room, I can tell you right now. Urban design guidelines. Wondering what they play in a role for, we see the prevalence of them. We've contributed in the last year to Broadview, but I myself am struggling, these guidelines being brought out, and what role do they play of identifying cultural heritage landscape?
I think they're helpful. They can help educate, inform, you know, pass knowledge down, etc. Because a lot of people don't understand all that stuff. But I gotta say, my big proviso is, if they're guidelines, they're just guidelines. They don't have any legal force. And I've had the experience, as many people here have, I'm sure, at the OMB, where you talk about council policy and guidelines and that. And they say, well, when were these guidelines adopted by council? Are they in the official plan of the zoning bylaw? No. Well, okay, next. They sound great and they are important, but if they're not embedded in some document and gone before the council, they don't have an awful lot of impact. Yeah.
So in this case, they did go to council.
Good.
So they are enshrined.
Okay. Well, that's great.
They're enshrined and now appealed by everyone.
At least they're trying.
Yeah, but I think that one of the things that I observe is within urban design and planning is they always point to us to say, where does the heritage lie? And I look to my colleagues who are professionals and say, where's the character of the neighborhood? I don't think this is something that's exclusive to the heritage specialists to understand character. And I think that's something to which we spoke earlier of the legislative silo. I think the professional silo has also led us to be everyone being a specialist and not about being multidisciplinary. So.
No, I don't have a comment, but it's a good observation, and I think character is incredibly important. And the character of Northeast Scarborough is not the character of the annex. and all kinds of other examples. And again, it's the one size doesn't fit all thing. And to try and capture what does character mean in the context of Bloor Street versus Lawrence Avenue or something is really important to try and get at. And that might be another way to come at this PBS thing. Because think of the character of Kenora versus downtown Toronto. This PBS applies to the whole province.
I can't get to my, somebody love that one.
Yeah, why don't I'll bring this mic.
Okay, I talked about Bobby Point, the other side of Jane Street, directly across the road from where Kathleen Nazars was living in 1913. By 1920, had a drugstore, a small fruit and vegetable store, a butcher shop, a bank, all of the, and a hardware store. Within another 15 years, there were 3 hardware stores, a series of places where you could buy food, bakeries, butcher shops, the whole works. Everything was within walking distance. The last of the banks closed a year ago. I now have to take a bus for a mile and then walk 8 blocks to go to my bank. The hardware store closed. We got another hardware store. There was a Chinese laundry, a Jewish food market. All of these things from 1925 until 1980, really booming. And only the last 5 years have we lost almost all of that total walkability of the neighborhood. And that was the other half of the essential of Bobby Point and the working class areas that were ancillary to that and that supported the old mill.
So I suppose the question is then, how do you preserve that mix of small businesses and the presence of small businesses through cultural heritage landscapes, or perhaps whether there's a connection between this conceptual framework and that idea of livability on the local scale and walkability? That's interesting. Paul, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm glad Mel raised that because that's a challenge all over the place as we're in this booming city and the rents go up and the market pressures are what they are. And I remember talking to, again, Jane Jacobs about that very question. Like, how do you ensure that you can walk, as everybody knows, she lived in Albany Avenue and walk down to Bloor Street with her shopping cart, right? How do you ensure that choice is there? Because that's what most people want if they have a choice. And you know what her answer was? She said, to be honest, she said, you could try and pass legislation, but it won't work because the market forces will be too strong. The only secure, guaranteed thing is for the merchants to buy their buildings and own them. And when they own them, eventually they'll sell them when they retire, and maybe they'll pass the business on, they sell the business, God knows what. But she said, if you don't own it, they're honestly, she didn't have an answer. She said, it's a huge problem everywhere because the market forces are so powerful that somebody will, and we've seen this all over the place. In the beach, I was out there's a lot of empty stores in the Queen Street and some in Bloor and elsewhere where, somebody gets greedy, they say, oh no, it's time to leave, I can get a higher rent. And that's the sad reality of it. The only other thing I thought about on this stuff is commercial rent control. We had residential rent control. Maybe because these little shops are so important to the character of the neighborhood that you can walk to your store and all this other stuff. Maybe that is a sidebar of the cultural landscape. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud here.
Well, I think to try and figure out how to make that work without government intervention, you'd have to ask your neighbors to and people in the beach why they're getting in their cars to drive to Loblaws rather than walking to the neighborhood shop. And I think that's going to be a difficult conversation to have, but food for thought, certainly. Do you have any other questions from?
They couldn't walk to the store.
Well, that's true. You have a cycle. Are there any more questions? No? Shall we wrap up? Jane, you are going to speak to us, yes?
Actually, I think Jeff is going to wrap things up.
Great. Okay, so just to wrap up, Jeff, you tell everybody. Thanks, Joe.